So let's take a look at arguments that Rachel considers for psychological egoism. One of the biggest obstacles for psychological egoism as a doctrine or a theory about human actions and its motivations is that it seems to prohibit that any actions could be performed altruistically. That is, there's no such thing, according to this view, of actions that are performed for motivations other than one's self-interest. And so, in order to defend psychological egoism, one has to argue that it's impossible to act altruistically, possible to act in ways that aren't specifically promoting one's own self-interest. And so let's look at the two arguments that Rachel offers up for psychological egoism and against altruism. And these arguments both have the same strategy. They take actions that seem altruistic or that seem to be inconsistent with acting from self-interest, and they reinterpret the motivations of those actions to make them look like would be consistent with this doctrine of psychological egoism. So the first argument that Rachel considers is the argument that we always do what we want to do. And he considers a number of different cases of altruism as potential empirical counterexamples to psychological egoism. And one of them is this case of Wallenberg, who was a Swedish businessman who left Sweden and went to Nazi-controlled Hungary, where he then engaged in activities that resulted in saving the lives of many Jewish people in Hungary that were otherwise going to be shipped off as part of Hitler's final solution. And he notes that Wallenberg not only advocated with the Hungarian government to stop implementing this final solution for the Nazis, but when the Hungarian government fell, he continued to actively help Jewish people escape Hungary and save their lives as a result. And he even stepped between Jewish people and Nazi officers and said, you can't take them unless you go through me, unless you shoot me. So he even sort of acted as a human shield for some of these people. And this looks like remarkably altruistic, above and beyond what even most people do. Right? He mentions another case of an 87-year-old woman who'd worked for 75 years as a maid, who'd never owned a car, who walked a mile each way to get her groceries, who saved up from this salary $150,000 that she seemingly altruistically used to endow a scholarship for African American students at the University of Mississippi. And again, this seems like a remarkably selfless, altruistic action. It doesn't seem at all clear or plausible that the motivation for this was this woman's self-interest. So what do we do in cases like this? Well, he tells us an anecdote about Abraham Lincoln, which embodies this argumentative strategy. And so the story goes that Abraham Lincoln was saying that all our actions are motivated by self-interest, while he was traveling with another person, Ed, I believe is the man's name, and they look out and they see a bunch of piglets who are in danger. And they're stuck in the mud by a river and they're going to drown or struggle until they die because they can't escape from this. And Abraham Lincoln supposedly tells the driver to stop, gets out of the coach, goes and saves those piglets. And his companion, this gentleman Ed, says, look, this seems like a selfless act. This doesn't seem like a selfish act. You're not seeming to maximize your own self-interest by doing this, Mr. Lincoln. And Lincoln then responds by reinterpreting this seeming motivation for doing this by saying, look, sure, I performed an action that resulted in benefit to these little piglets, but really I was doing it out of my own self-interest because my peace of mind would have been deeply disturbed had I not performed that action to benefit those piglets. So really, I was acting in a way that was promoting my own self-interest. I was doing what I really wanted to do, even though what I really wanted to do also had this effect of helping other people or creatures. And Rachel's wants to reject this argument, right? And this argument strategy generally. And he gives us two reasons why he thinks this argument strategy doesn't work in this case. First of all, he says, look, sometimes, right, our strongest desire, the thing that we most want to do or to happen, isn't the thing that we actually do or try to accomplish. So sometimes we act in ways that are contrary to our own strongest desire. So sometimes he thinks we act because we think we ought to do something, not because it's what we desire. So an example of something like this, suppose you're, say, dieting, and you want that cheesecake that's in your refrigerator. That's your strongest desire, right? That's what you really want. Right? But you don't go and eat that piece of cheesecake because you act in a way that you think you ought to do. You act contrary to what you really deeply desire because you think that you ought to act that way. You think that your strongest desire isn't the sort of thing that you actually ought to do. And he often points out that our strongest desires actually oftentimes run contrary to our own self-interest. Right? So oftentimes what we desire the most may not be what is in our best interest over the long run. So eating all those pieces of cheesecake and not maintaining a healthy weight is actually contrary to our own self-interest. And so psychological egoism would predict that we wouldn't do that. But we, in fact, oftentimes do that. Right? And so he says, trying to reinterpret the motivations for our actions in the way that Lincoln does is extremely difficult in these cases. He says, it's hard to imagine that Wallenberg's strongest desire was something that was consistent with risking his life. And he points out that Wallenberg disappeared and that the best theory about what happened to him was that after the Nazis were overthrown by Stalin and Russian army, he was killed. So he ultimately died, which certainly isn't in his self-interest. So he was pursuing actions that weren't consistent with his strongest desires, say, for instance, his desire for his own self-preservation. He was doing things that he ought to do. And similarly for Lincoln. Right? These reinterpretations of our motivations, Rachel argues, are difficult to maintain in a lot of cases. Now, the second argument that we see is similar. This argument says, look, the reason why we perform the actions that we do isn't that they result in necessarily obvious benefits to us directly, but they result in benefits to us because they make us feel good about ourselves, they make us feel like we're doing the right thing, they make us happy, things of this nature, right? And this is the sort of thing that Lincoln refers to as well, right? And Rachel wants to argue that it's difficult for us to consistently reinterpret the motivations of these seemingly altruistic actions in a way that they're ultimately just understood as being motivated by our desire to feel good about ourselves, our desire to feel like we're good people, and so on. And he gives us two reasons for supposing that it's difficult to reinterpret such altruistic actions in this way. The first thing is he says, look, deriving pleasure from an action doesn't mean that it is exclusively a self-interested action. So he says, look, sure, people may derive pleasure from doing good things. And in fact, there's a lot of empirical research to suggest that when you do things like donate money to charity, right, that actually makes you happier than just spending that money on yourself. Right? So they oftentimes give $20 to students and say, look, you can either give it to this charity, or you can spend it on yourself. And then they have these measures of the people's reported self-happiness. And what they discover is the people who donate it actually end up feeling happier than the people who don't donate it. So it's true that we do derive pleasure from acting in ways that are altruistic or not self-interested exclusively. However, just because we derive pleasure from it, that doesn't mean that that was the motivation for our doing it. And that doesn't mean that our motivations weren't altruistic. Sure, we may benefit in some indirect way, like we feel pleasure. But nevertheless, our motivations are altruistic because they're trying to achieve a goal that isn't in our self-interest, strictly speaking. It may also accomplish a goal of making us feel better. That's certainly not the primary objective. That's not the most salient outcome for us. And to drive that home, he talks about cases where we act independently of anticipating how that action is going to make us feel. So he suggests, look, oftentimes we'll act in ways where we just don't anticipate how the action is going to make us feel afterwards. Right? And our action clearly in these cases, he suggests, is motivated by our desired outcome and not by our anticipation about how it's going to make us feel. And I, in fact, actually had an experience like this this summer. I was in Portugal, in this town called Porto. I was walking across this bridge that has a pedestrian lane, and it also has metro rapid transit trains running across it. And there's no barrier between the train tracks and the pedestrian lanes. And as I'm walking along, I notice this. I think to myself, it's kind of dangerous. And then I hear the buzzer that says the train is coming. And I look back, and sure enough, the train is zooming towards us. And there's this young woman standing on the tracks trying to take a picture of her friend against the railing of this bridge. And she's completely oblivious to this train running out. Now, I didn't stop to think, how am I going to feel if I save her? I just thought, geez, she's in danger. I ran out in the tracks and I pulled her back. Right? Now, my motivation wasn't how I was going to feel about myself later on. My motivation simply was I perceived this person's in danger, and I thought the thing to do is to go out there. I didn't really even anticipate, very carefully weigh how much danger I was putting myself in. Right? So these are the sort of cases that Rachel feels really are telling against this reinterpretation on the basis of altruistic actions make me feel good, and that's ultimately why I do them. He says, no, look, people act in ways that they think are the right thing to do. They are ways that promote things that are beneficial to other creatures or other people. And while they may anticipate even, but certainly they may feel good as a result of their actions, that's not their primary motivation in doing those actions. That's just a good side effect of those actions. And so that's Rachel's criticism of this second argument and of this overall strategy of trying to reinterpret seemingly altruistic actions by positing self-interested, psychologically self-interested motivations for those actions and reinterpreting those actions in light of those posited selfish motivations.